Can you explain how constructivism relates to educational technology?
So there's a lot of different ways that educational technology can instantiate or support constructivist pedagogy. Well, there's interactivity, there's self-pacing. What we aspire to very often as teachers as self-organization or being able to learn on their own, students learning on their own. These are really important characteristics, and we know that where constructivism is this idea that we actively construct information in our mind, you can do that through interactivity, and the educational technology allows you to do that. So if you wanted to learn the principle of osmosis, in a textbook you might read that the water molecules are exchanged across membranes, but what happens with textbooks is that's very static. That's a very static representation of the phenomenon. If you instead used a simulation of osmotic process going on in the body, you could actually see the dynamic exchange over time of the water molecules. And if that's coupled with, say, buttons or sliders or some interactive devices with like outputs where you could actually measure the variation that you've inputted into the simulation, then the student can actually begin tailoring their own learning experiences with this simulation. That's typically what happens with educational technology, particularly simulations. Simulations can also help the learner who may have challenges in the classroom keeping up with the instruction. The simulation can provide a tool for the student to go back and revisit the information and learn at their own pace. So it doesn't limit their learning to what's happening in the classroom. Another thing that educational technologies, in particular simulations, can do, but other technologies can do this, is that they provide details of hidden information. You can understand an ecological system from a bird's eye view with all the variables or all the different aspects of the ecology and how they interact. You can actually see that going on in real time. You can also zoom in on a section of that ecological system to study that section in more detail. And so you can toggle between different levels of representation of that phenomenon.
How does constructionism then sort of stem from constructivism? What's the difference and where does it come from?
So constructionism owes its legacy to Seymour Papert. He worked for, I think, 5 years at the University of Geneva in Switzerland with Jean Piaget. And so he really was a disciple of constructivism. But he was also had great interests in computation. Papert talked about objects to think with. And he believed that these concrete objects could be his famous Logo turtle or a robot that is built, could be potentially built by the learner, or it could be just pre-built. But that is used for the learner to use it to help them think with. They could almost inhabit this object, and they could feel it, emotionally as well as physically, which way these things are going. He called that syntonic learning. Papert really believed in this learning culture, and he believed that this peer community that had people who were more or less experts in the community could contribute to the design of the community and help it grow and emerge and change shape. So the learning culture was every bit as important as what it was that they were learning. And constructivism and constructionism have a great deal in common, principally that people construct their own knowledge. So let's say constructivism and genetics or any kind of scientific phenomenon. So in a constructivist classroom, you could take any kind of inquiry-based approach. And the student could ask a question about why it is that they look very similar to their parents. They can go and research it. They could even do a few experiments. They could, maybe perform an empirical study. And they could have this information, and that it could be at some level evaluated as correct or not correct. But all this while they are sort of checking to see whether they've understood it well. Also, the teacher is helping to check that, whether they've understood it well or not, where are the misconceptions, and then through facilitation, some of these misconceptions could potentially be remediated. In a constructionist classroom, all of that would happen as well, but a few things might be added to a constructionist classroom. So, for example, they could construct or make a model or a computer simulation of their understanding of genetics. They would be able to manipulate this information, do their empirical tests as well at their own pace, and importantly, they'd be sharing this with the other students in the classroom, and the other students would be asking questions of this particular model that you've constructed, and helping you improve your knowledge of genetics together.
So you've talked about Piaget and constructivism and how that influenced theories of constructionism. What other theories influenced constructionism?
After Piaget, there was another psychologist, Russian, Lev Vygotsky, who we talk about in terms of social constructivism. And Vygotsky's ideas really hinged on language and culture being important for learning. So Piaget believed that these stages, it wasn't until students or children got to these stages, between these typical ages, that they could actually learn. Vygotsky, on the other hand, didn't actually believe that. He thought that you could learn anything at any stage. And students children and adults as well, come to a learning experience with some quantity of information. And instruction happens, or ought to happen, beyond that quantity of information in order for them to grow. And he believed that the arbiter, or the tool that is used for this, is discursive interaction. And so in the difference between social constructivism and constructivism is that development leads learning, according to Piaget. Whereas for Vygotsky, learning leads development. That's a difference.
So in that case, let's think about math, for example. If you were my teacher,
I'm a science person, but that's okay.
Science, okay.
Okay.
So if you were assessing my knowledge of biology and how you might teach me, you would have to think about where I am now, how much I know about osmosis. Maybe I have some rudimentary understanding of it, but maybe my friend knows it really well, or knows nothing. Maybe doesn't even have a rudimentary understanding. So you might teach us differently, even though we might be of the same age, to how to. The instructional experience might be different for the two of us.
Absolutely, and that's different. That's quite different from the way that we taught in a behaviorist mode. In a behaviorist mode, the belief was everybody learned at the same pace, in the same way. In a constructivist, and then later on in a social constructivist way, there's a lot of differentiating that's going on. And that's typically done through what we call inquiry or guided instruction. And so you would go into a classroom, a social constructivist classroom. What would be different than the behaviors classroom is you would hear lots of discussion going on. Small groups. You may know a little bit more than me. I get to tap into what you know. You're asking me questions. I might have something, or I might interpret the phenomenon in a different way, so you're also learning from me. So this kind of community knowledge that grows is a collective understanding And if you do it right, everybody gets to have a part of that knowledge, as opposed to where you're just learning, you happen to be the smart kid in the class, you know it, but I'll never know it.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks to Susan Yoon for talking to us today about constructivism, constructionism, and educational technology. Thanks for being with us.
You're welcome. Pleasure.